officially to everybody here, and welcome to our international audience around the world. This is the first day of the Feast of Tabernacles, and I want to tell you, for those of you who are new to this, it has nothing to do with the tabernacle in the wilderness where they offered up sacrifices. Good morning. What the word tabernacle means is tents or shelters or cabins where you have this is what people do when they go camping. They get a temporary booth or a tent or a trailer or a little camping trailer. And God said, I want you to do that for a week. And so the ideal way to keep the feast is when you have thousands of people together, you get together and have a big revival for a whole week. And by the time that last day is over, you don't want to go home. It's a wonderful time. So what does the Feast of Tabernacles picture? Why did God tell us to take off in the middle of the week, sometimes a smack dab in the middle, and stop working? It's so important. God said, I want you to work. Now, you can work the rest of the week, but this first day is a holy day. We're not allowed to work at all, none whatsoever, if we're going to obey God and keep it the way He tells us to. But ideally, and there are people, thousands of people today that are starting the Feast of Tabernacles around the world. In fact, there's a group at Myrtle Beach. One or two groups, I think. I thought about sneaking in there sometime. I have class, so I can't do it. But yeah, there are some small Christian churches that do celebrate these feast days. They're scattered. They're usually pretty small. But there are probably 2 or 3 or more groups down at Myrtle Beach this year. And I thought about them last night. I could have gone down there and they usually start their service the first night, the eve of the first holy day. Thought, man, I could go down there and sneak in, see what's going on. But we think that, our little group, we're the only weird group in the whole world. No, there are thousands of Christians worldwide that celebrate the holy days. It's just that you don't hear much about them. And do not celebrate Halloween. The churches of Israel is getting ready to celebrate Halloween. Now, in the autumn, you have 4 holy days. Don't listen to Perry Stone. He doesn't keep them. He doesn't know what he's talking about. He said there are 3. Poor fellow can't count. There are 4 holy days. Trumpets is the first one, the first day of the 7th month. And all the 4 holy days occur in the 7th month. And that pictures, the Apostle Paul told us that when the trumpets sound, it's at the last trumpet that Christ returns. And then after that, 10 days later, inclusive, you have the Day of Atonement. After Jesus comes back, there's a little bit of time between the time he actually returns and when the whole world is atoned. But the word atoned can also be translated reconciliation. The entire world is going to be reconciled to Christ. And I explained to you, that cannot happen as long as the devil's running loose. I mean, even if Jesus were here, straightening out the world, the devil comes right behind him and starts a problem or a riot or something like that. So no, Jesus is going to get rid of that rascal and put him away for 1,000 years. Then we have, after the Day of Atonement, we have 2 more holy days. And the 3rd holy day in the autumn is the Feast of Tabernacles. The first day is a holy day. But now the Feast of Tabernacles is a week long. It goes 7 days. So the 7th day ends next Sunday this year. And then the last holy day will be 8 days from today, counting starting with today. And the Bible calls it the 8th day. In the New Testament, John chapter 7 talks about the last great day. That's referring to the 8th day. What is that about? Well, next Monday, I'm going to give you the message. It's one of the most beautiful messages that anybody has ever heard. So be sure to be here for that day. In fact, if you couldn't come to any of these holy day services, but just one, that would be the one I'd want you to come to because the message is so beautiful. That'll be next Monday at the same hour, 10:30 in the morning. For those of you watching online, that's 10:30 Eastern time in the United States. Let's go to Deuteronomy chapter 16 and learn about these festivals. In chapter 16 of Deuteronomy, for all those of you who have doctoral degrees in theology, that is the 5th book of the Old Testament. Verse 1, observe the month of Abib. Now, if you look in the margin, it says April. And keep the Passover to the Lord. So that's the first festival, is the Passover. Verse 9, then you count 7 weeks from Passover. You begin to number the 7 weeks from the time you put the sickle to the corn. That would be on the first day of the week during Passover. Passover is a 7-day festival. Verse 10, and you shall keep the Feast of Weeks. And you're to do it with a tribute of a free will offering. That's above and beyond the tithes. And then verse 13. Now remember, God tells us there, I should have read verse 16 to start with. 3 times in the year. Passover, the Feast of Weeks, we call it Pentecost. And in the autumn, you have Tabernacles. Now let's read verse 13. You shall observe the Feast of Tabernacles 7 days. Now, we're not going to be able to do the whole 7 days like I'd like to do, where we go out and camp. But if we get enough people of one day, that would be really, you'd be surprised how much enjoyment that is. Where you have Christians together with other Christians singing and praising God for a whole 7 days is a wonderful time. After you've gathered in your corn and your wine, this is the time when the harvest occurs. And you're to rejoice in your feast. You, your son, your daughter, your manservant, your maidservant. All right, now, let's go ahead and read verse 15. Then I'm going to show you something in verse 16. Verse 15, 7 days you're to keep a solemn feast. Solemn doesn't mean sad. It means it's serious. Unto the Lord your God, and the place which he shall choose. Because the Lord your God shall bless you in all your increase and all the works of your hands. Therefore you're to rejoice. That means you're to have a good time. God's religion is not a boring, dull, sad religion. It's a time of rejoicing. God's religion is one of happiness and joy. Yes, sir?
Isn't verse 10 pretty important in this whole scheme of things?
Yeah, you're the second person to bring that up to me today. It does say in verse 10, you shall keep the feast with a tribute of a free will offering of your hand. There was a guy, I see these guys on television who talk about the holy days, and I say, oh, they're talking about the holy days, and I'll listen, tune in, and all they're talking about the holy days for is a gimmick to raise funds, fundraising. And I guess I shy away from that. You're the second person to bring that up to me. I don't talk much about the offering. And I was told this morning, I was gently rebuked, you're depriving people of the blessing, because that's part of keeping the holy days, is to bring a holy day offering over and above the tithe. And so, yeah, you're right. So, in the mouth of 2 witnesses, every word will be established. So, okay, so maybe God wants me to teach on this. And we'll see this in verse 16 and 17. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God, in the place which you shall choose. Unleavened bread, that's Passover, Feast of Weeks, we call that Pentecost. And then the Feast of Tabernacles. And they shall not appear before the Lord empty. What does he mean? Every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of the Lord. So yes, an offering over and above the tithe is the way the church is to celebrate the holy days. That is their understanding of it. Everybody's to bring an offering. So we've got a box back there for tithes and offerings, and if you'd like to help us, because of your support of this ministry, we're able to be on radio and to do the things that we do. And God didn't call one man to do anything. He called a group. He called a team. He calls it a church. The church is supposed to get behind the work of God. So don't ever look at me and say, boy, Keith's going to get a real reward in the kingdom, won't he, for all that teaching. If the people were not tithing and supporting the ministry, I couldn't do it. So what Matthew 10 says, those who support the minister gets the same reward. So whatever great reward, hopefully, that God gives me, those of you who put your tithes and offerings into this ministry share in that reward.
And those that are watching online that want to give can give online at our website, ChristianFellowshipMinistries.org.
That's something new.
Yeah, we've had it since June.
Yeah, so those who online who would like to give a holy day offering can do it. How do they do it?
Go to ChristianFellowshipMinistries.org, and at the bottom of the page it says donate, and then it'll say online giving, and if you click there, you can either put in your checking account information or your debit card information.
I should be giving you the microphone.
Or your credit card information.
Go to ChristianFellowshipMinistries.org and go to the bottom of the page and click on what?
Click on online giving, and then
Click on online giving.
And then just follow the steps.
And then just follow the instructions.
It's secure. I've used it.
It's a secure website, so you don't have to worry about losing any information there.
Right.
So if you'd like to participate, that'd be great. I have never been one in over 35 years to ever pass a plate.
That's
Never
true.
have.
And I can attest to that for the last 17.
I've never passed a plate. Now, when I go to other churches and speak, they pass plates, and sometimes they'll pass a plate to give me a love offering, but in my own church, I have never, ever passed a plate. Now, it's not wrong to do it. I just chose not to do it because my emphasis is not on trying to get from you. My emphasis is to give to you and to bless you so that you're going to have a great reward in God's kingdom.
There's a question
Jesus said, freely you've received, freely give. Yeah.
Are we supposed to work this week?
Yeah, it's okay to work. Yeah, it's okay.
Just not on the holy days?
Just not on the holy days. Today, and of course Saturday, and then next Monday. These are holy days of God.
But Tuesday through Friday this week we can work.
Tuesday through Friday, you can work your normal job if you want to. If we had several hundred people here, we'd be out at probably that campground out there that I found a few years ago. It was really nice. And we'd all be camping out, so we wouldn't be working. But there might be some people that might have to go to work for a few hours or something like that. But I know some churches that have had services in the morning and in the afternoon during these days. That gets to be pretty complicated. The best way to do is have just one service a day, or maybe in the evenings, and that'd be great. I attended a feast in St. Louis, Missouri some years ago, and they just had a lot of their services in the evening, and that's okay too. However you want to do it. Now, verse 16 says, 3 times, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles, shall all your males appear before the Lord. And yet we just read in verse 14 that God wants you to bring the wife, the daughter, and your son, and anybody else. The men had no excuse. The women might be pregnant or they're nursing a baby. They couldn't make the journey. God said, okay, but you men have no excuse. You men are to be here. But if you can bring your wife and your son and your daughter and your maidservant too, bring them all. Bring the whole family.
Anybody within your gates is what it says.
Anybody within your gates, bring them all. Now, if your wife can't come or your daughter can't come because maybe she's got a little baby, God said, that's okay. But the rest of you, you be there. And then verse 17, every man shall give as he is able, according to the blessing of God. Now, I want to go to chapter 12 here in Deuteronomy and show you a little bit of information here. Verse 5 says, the place which the Lord shall choose, and of course we know that was Jerusalem, and yet we see that in the New Testament they observed the holy days outside of Jerusalem, but they didn't offer the sacrifices. But at the place where the Lord shall choose to put his name there, thither shall thou come. Let's put that in modern English. That's where you come. Verse 6, and thither you shall bring your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, and your tithes. And of course that was eventually Jerusalem. And let's see, where was the other verse I wanted to read here? Verse 7, and there you'll eat before the Lord, you'll rejoice in all that you put your hand to, you and your households. So everybody in the household is allowed to come. Verse 11, then there shall be a place which the Lord your God shall choose once you come into the promised land. We know that to be Jerusalem. He'll cause his name to dwell there. There shall you bring all that I command you, your burnt offerings, your sacrifices, and your tithes. Everything had to go there. So understand, they had to bring a tithe of their flocks, their herds, their grains. Most of them were farmers, their vegetables, their fruits. A tithe. Now, their station wagons weren't all that big, so they couldn't really put everything in the back of the station wagon. So God tells us, if you need to, you can take the tithe, sell it at market value, take the money, and bring that with you. It's the same thing. So if you're a farmer and you want to bring 10% of your sheep to the church, of course I can't eat 10%, but you know what we'll do is we'll have a big feast and invite everybody to come out to eat, and the rest of it we'll turn it into money like God said to. So he said here in verse 21, let's look at verse 13 first. Verse 13, take heed to yourself that you offer not your burnt offerings in every place. You can't offer burnt offerings in Kannapolis, for example, but in the place which God shall choose. Now verse 18, let's look at that. But you must eat them before the Lord your God in the place which he'll choose. Now notice, you and your son and your daughter, if she can make it, and the manservant and the maidservant. He didn't actually mention the wife, but obviously if the man goes and the wife can go, she's going to be going too if he brings his daughter. Pretty obvious. And what can you eat at these feasts, various feasts, Passover, Pentecost, and Tabernacles? What can you eat? Verse 20, when the Lord your God shall enlarge your borders, he's promised you, and you shall say, I'll eat flesh. Flesh means you're eating meat. Because your soul longs to eat flesh, thou mayest eat flesh, whatever your soul lusteth after, obviously in the context of clean and unclean. If the place which the Lord your God has chosen to put his name there be too far from you, then you kill of your herd and your flock, as I've commanded you, and you shall eat it in your gates if you can't come. You don't offer up sacrifices, you can't do that. And then he says, even as the roebuck and the hart, those are clean animals. And verse 23, but you can't eat of the blood. So God said you could do that. Then chapter 14 of Deuteronomy, which is kind of interesting, verse 24. If the way be too far from you, and you're not able to carry all your herds and your flocks in your station wagon or whatever, if the place be too far, which the Lord your God shall choose to place his name there, verse 25, then you're to turn it into money. So what you do is you would sell what you were going to bring, take the money, put it in your pocket, bind up the money in your hand, and you shall go to the place which God shall choose. Now these wonderful feasts, listen to what he says here in verse 26. You shall bestow that money, it's called festival money, for whatsoever thy soul lusteth after. For oxen, all these are clean animals. That means you could have a big sirloin steak or other kinds of steaks are there. Sirloin, ribeye, prime rib, filet. You could have any kind of steak you want. Or for sheep, if you like lamb chops. Or for wine. Now, you Baptists didn't hear that, right? Just put your hands over your ears.
I'm waiting to hear the next one.
For wine, or for strong drink, something other than wine. Strong drink, that's not Coca-Cola or Pepsi-Cola. Strong drink means it's got something strong in it. Or for whatever your soul desires. Now, God didn't say it's okay to get drunk. I hear these Baptist preachers, especially independent Baptist preachers, who will say the Bible condemns drunkenness. Yeah, it does. So because the Bible condemns drunkenness, don't you dare even smell a glass of wine. The Bible condemns gluttony, so therefore don't even eat a morsel of food. Right? Now you have to understand it's the abuse. Too much food, too much drink, yeah, that's wrong. And there you'll eat before the Lord, you shall rejoice, you and your household. You understand? So these feast days are times of rejoicing, and I wish, you know how the Jews do it? They have dances in the front of their church or their synagogue, and they have Hebrew music, which is really nice. You don't have to do that, but it's pretty. Anybody ever been to one of those services where you've seen them dance?
I've heard them on YouTube, and I like the music.
Yeah, music's good, Hebrew music. I went to one, it was some years ago, and they had the ladies up front, and they had these scarves and whatever, and they were beautiful music. Now, in Exodus 23, this is the first time we actually learn very much at all about these feast days. This is when they were at Mount Sinai. He had just given the Ten Commandments in chapter 20. 21, 22, and 23 are the judgments and statutes. And chapter 23, verse 14, 3 times you're to keep a feast. 3 times. You shall keep the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which the Bible calls Passover. Verse 16, the Feast of Harvest, which is also the Feast of Weeks, or what we call Pentecost. And the Feast of Ingathering, the usual word is Tabernacles, which is in the end of the year, the harvest year, when you have gathered in your labors out of the field. 3 times in the year shall all your males appear before the Lord your God. You know, I read that as a teenager and I thought, man, that sounds like fun. I wish we did that today. I didn't know what it was. But I said, that sounds like fun. How come we don't do that today? And then some years later, I found out. I was probably a preteen. I was probably 11 or 12 when I first read that. And then I found out what these feasts were. So, this is the 3rd time, the 3rd season, which has 4 holy days in it. Now let's go to chapter 23 of Leviticus and find out exactly what this feast is and when it is and what it means and that type of thing. Chapter 23, verse 2, these are the feasts of the Lord. These are not Jewish feasts. Purim is Jewish. Hanukkah, that's Jewish. These are feasts of the Lord that he commanded. It's not wrong for a Jew to observe those other feasts. They're national feasts, just like we have July 4th and Thanksgiving and so on. But these are God's feasts. Now, verse 4, was there a question there?
No, but it just dawned on me why they're not down at the synagogue today, probably.
Why?
Because a couple of years ago, not this past year, but year before last, they all camped out at like Camp Spencer or somewhere. And they did a week
Or Camp Wesley, wasn't it?
Camp Wesley, maybe.
Yeah.
That might be why they're not there.
I meant to ask him if they're going to be camping somewhere. And these are Jews. Interesting. Verse 4, but these are the feasts of the Lord, holy convocations, which you shall proclaim in their seasons. Now, verse 5 talks about what the New Testament calls the preparation day. It's the preparation for the feast of the Passover. Verse 16, when does the feast of the Passover begin? And on the 15th day of the same month is the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And there are 2 holy days connected with that. Verses 10 through 14 is not a holy day. That's the wave sheaf from which you count Pentecost. And verse 15, you're to count unto you from that day that you offer the wave sheaf, you're to count 7 Sabbaths. 7 times 7 is 49. And verse 16, you add one more day, and that's the 50th day. Pentecost is a Greek word that means 50th. Verse 21 says this is a statute forever. And Exodus 12 says Passover is forever. So Passover is forever, Pentecost is forever, and these holy days, all of them are forever. Verse 24 talks about the Feast of Trumpets, which we talked about 2 weeks ago. Verse 27 talks about the Day of Atonement, which was just 5 days ago. And verse 31, do no manner of work, it's a statute forever. All right, then in verse 34, speak to the children of Israel, saying, the 15th day of this 7th month. How do we know we've got the right day? Because on the 29th of September, the new moon was seen, not just here, but in Jerusalem. And when the new moon was seen, God says, when you see the new moon, you'll see it at sundown. That day begins the 7th month. Every new moon, when it's seen, begins a month. That was the 7th new moon, counting from spring. Now, from the 29th of September, that evening until last night, that began the 15th day, last night at sundown. So today is the 15th day. So we are here on the exact day that God told us to be in church on. The 15th day shall be the Feast of Tabernacles for 7 days. Verse 35, on the first day, that's today, shall be a holy convocation. You shall do no servile work. Now, verse 36, the priest had to offer an offering by fire. That's a burnt offering. Then it says, on the 8th day, that's next Monday, shall be a holy convocation. It's a solemn assembly. Do no work. Now, common sense tells you that the 8th day is not part of the Feast of Tabernacles. Why? Because it's only 7 days. What is that mysterious 8th day? Come next Monday, we'll talk about it. Now, verse 39, in the 15th day you shall have gathered in the fruit of the land. When you've gathered it in, you shall keep a feast. 7 days. The first day will be a Sabbath, and on the 8th day a Sabbath. So it's connected to the Feast of Tabernacles, and yet it's not part of it. Now, how did they observe the Feast of Tabernacles? Verse 40, you're to take on the first day the boughs of goodly trees, branches of palm trees, boughs of thick trees. They didn't have canvas to make a tent in those days. Willows of the brook, and to rejoice 7 days. How? Verse 41, you're to keep it a feast to the Lord 7 days of the year. It shall be a statute forever. Okay? Celebrate the 7th month. Now, verse 42 says they were to dwell in booths 7 days. All that are Israelites born. But remember, Exodus 12:49 says, and the stranger has the same law. Numbers 15, verse 15, the strangers have the same law. So whatever God told the Israelites to do, the strangers, I'm a Gentile, that's what that is, we're to do the same thing. So it's forever in the 7th month. When Christ returns, he's not going to say, oh, you don't have to do that anymore. I've done away with all that. No, Jesus is the same today, yesterday, today, and forever. So if he said it's forever, he's not going to change his mind. He didn't change his mind at the cross. Oh, yeah, he did away with all the laws. Well, he said, now don't think I've come to destroy the law or the prophets. He said, I didn't come to destroy them. Till heaven and earth pass away. Not a jot or a tittle. And driving in here this morning, you happened to notice that earth was still here. Maybe you saw the full moon last night. So guess what? Heaven and earth has not disappeared. And until it does disappear, the Feast of Tabernacles will still be in force and effect. And yet the whole church world does not understand that for some reason. Now, I want you to take a look. You don't have to go to all these scriptures, but you might at least want to write them down. Nehemiah chapter 8 and verse 14. After the Jews have been taken into captivity, then they come back. And chapter 8, do we have a question? Let me get this real quick, and then we'll take a question. Verse 14, they found written law. This is when they came out of Babylon, came back to Israel, back to Palestine. They found written in the law where God said that they shouldn't dwell in booths in the feast of the 7th month. So they published it throughout the city that they should make booths, as it is written. Verse 16, where did they put these little booths, these little lean-tos? So the people went forth and brought them and made themselves booths, every one upon the roof of his house, and in their courts, and in the courts of the house of God, and in the street, wherever they could have a place to find one, they put one. And all the congregation of them that were come again out of the captivity made booths, and sat under the booths. For since the days of Joshua unto this the son of Nun, unto that day have not the children of Israel done so. Now I have a marginal note here.
They're doing it for remembrance then.
Yeah, to remember that they'd come out of Egypt and was 40 years living in booths for 40 years. Now my reference note here said it is not meant that there had not been some formal observance of the Feast of Tabernacles, because we know for a fact that there was, if you read Chronicles, but that the people had not dwelt in booths for some reason. They had not done that. Now, all right, now what's the question over there?
So we must go to a hotel room, question mark?
No, not necessarily. And then some people say a motel room, you can't do that. You got to go actually go find you some palm branches. What if you don't have any palm trees? Where we don't have palm trees.
We don't have palm trees in North Carolina.
The reason that God said go out and get palm branches is because that was what was available to them. Get willows of the brook. There must have been some willows out there. Now, if you live up in Canada, what are you going to do? You can't do that.
Steve Harrison can build an igloo.
Yeah, Steve Harrison, one of the guys, I hope he's watching, he can build an igloo out of ice. The point is, you leave your home and you dwell in a temporary dwelling.
But
We call that a camp meeting.
But you don't have to.
No, especially, if you don't have enough people. I mean, I make my booth my room where I read my Bible. That's my booth, until we can go out and get enough people to actually have some tents or cabins, whatever. In fact, there's a place at Marble Mountain. They got cabins down there if you can rent.
They do.
That'd be nice. How many do they have? Anybody know?
I have no idea.
I don't know either, but they got cabins down there. We get enough people, we'll go down to
Isn't
Marble
there
Mountain.
another lake, like out off of, in Rockwell or somewhere that's got little,
Rockwell, I don't know a thing about. That's
It's not like
way
that place.
up there in Rowan County.
I know, right?
I don't know a thing about Rockwell. Zechariah 14.
Bryson City.
Bryson City?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I don't know. Zechariah 14, you might want to turn there and read this with me. Since Jesus is the same today as he was yesterday, and he hasn't changed, and he hasn't done away with anything, and he's not going to, when he comes back, is he going to tell people then, okay, I've changed my mind, these holy days are all done away? Now, Zechariah 14, verse 1 says, behold, the day. What day? Well, if you look at chapter 12, verse 3, it says, in that day. Verse 4, in that day. Verse 6, in that day. Verse 8, in that day. Talking about David's going to be resurrected. Verse 9, it shall come to pass in that day. That's referring to the day of the Lord. Verse 11, in that day. Chapter 13, verse 1, in that day. Verse 2, in that day. Over and over and over. Verse 4, in that day. So what is that day? Chapter 14, verse 1, the day of the Lord. When it comes, he talks about this battle here. Verse 3, God will go forth and fight against those people. Remember, in that day, the slain of the Lord will be many. When he fights against them, guess who's going to win? They're going to lose. Verse 4, and his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives. I was listening to a Seventh-day Adventist preacher on radio or television, one or the other, and he said that when Christ returns, his feet will not land on the earth. He'll just simply come down, whisk away the Christians, and take them all to heaven. And everybody who's left will be killed and destroyed, and this earth will be desolate for 1,000 years. Oh, good grief. That's exactly the opposite of what the Bible says. Here it says, in that day, he's not coming down like a yo-yo and going back. He's going to make a three-point landing, as pilots use the term. He's going to stand where? On the Mount of Olives. When Jesus went to heaven, he was standing on the Mount of Olives after his resurrection. And the disciples said, will you at this time establish the kingdom to Israel? He said, it's not for you to know. About that time, he slowly rose off the ground. They're watching him. Wow. And he kept going and going. Next thing you know, he's probably increasing in speed right through a cloud. And they're all like this, gazing into heaven. And about that time, an angel shows up and says, why do you men stand there gazing up into heaven? This same Jesus, whom you've seen go into heaven, shall so come in like manner. Like manner. He's coming back to the very spot where he took off. He took off from the Mount of Olives. He is not coming back to Independence, Missouri, as the reorganized Church of Joseph Smith of Latter-day Saints has taught. They say he's coming back to Independence, Missouri, the home of Harry Truman. No, he's coming back to the Mount of Olives. Well, where is the Mount of Olives? Which is before Jerusalem on the east. The Mount of Olives is not in Missouri. Just want to let everybody know that, okay? If you don't know your geography too well.
Is that a designated spot in Israel as today?
Yeah, they know exactly where it is. You can stand, I've not been there, but I understand you can stand on the Mount of Olives and look at the Temple Mount. Yes, sir?
Well, the Bible says that every eye shall see him, every knee shall bow.
Yeah.
You know.
Everybody's
He's
going
coming back where everybody can see him. He ain't coming back in no clouds and just scoop up somebody and go back. He's coming where everybody can see him.
Yeah, a lot of people think that he's only coming down here to scoop away people, and then nobody will know what happened until the next morning when all these millions of people are missing. What happened? What happened? I don't know. What do you think happened? Well, I don't know. What do you think happened? I mean, you reckon maybe the Lord came and nobody saw him? The Bible says every eye shall see him.
Right? Every knee shall bow.
I heard a medical doctor say this one time. I went to hear him speak, and he was speaking at a Christian businessman's meeting, and he had gotten saved. And here he is, a medical doctor with all this great education, but he made a statement I never forgot. He said, if God didn't mean what he said in the Bible, he shouldn't have said it because I'm dumb enough to believe him. How about you? Are you dumb enough? If a medical doctor who's had 8 years of college can be dumb enough to believe God, I think I should be. I want to be dumb enough to just believe whatever he says. And he says he's coming back and he's going to stand on this earth. He's not taking people to heaven. He's coming here to live. Verse 5, the last two lines, the Lord my God shall come. Jesus is the Lord our God. And all the saints with thee, the ones that are dead, he'll resurrect them. The ones who are still alive will just simply be caught up to meet him, and then we're all coming back with him. Verse 9, and the Lord shall be king, not up in heaven, but over all the earth in that day. That contradicts what a lot of people think. I'm not here to try to contradict the churches, but the churches are contradicting what this says. He's not taking us to heaven. He's coming here to live with us. Why would he come down here and take us to heaven if he's planning to come here and be king? He's not going to be king up in heaven. He's coming down here. Remember in Luke 19, he likened himself to a nobleman who went to a far country to get a kingdom and to return. Jesus is coming back with that kingdom, and he's going to come back with a crown as Lord of Lords and King of Kings to rule this earth. Do we have another question?
As it is in heaven.
Yeah, God's will will be done on earth as it is in heaven, but it'll be done here. Is there a question?
So, if I'm sleeping in the living room, would that be okay? And I put yes, that could be your temporary dwelling.
Yeah, absolutely, if he wants to do that. I'm glad that there are people that want to obey God.
I know.
And I'll tell you what, let's say that God says, no, Keith, that's wrong. Do you know what fact? Let me tell you something. If we are trying to serve God, we don't do it quite right, do you know that God's not going to stomp on you or knock you down and slap you down? He's going to say, son, daughter, I'm glad you tried. Now let's tweak it and get it right, but you're trying. How many people out there are not even trying? And you can tell them what the Bible says, I don't want to do that. Well, there's a difference. But when a person is trying, even if we get it wrong, if we're trying, God smiles and says, he might even say, well done, because you tried. I mean, good grief. I'm not going to ask you to raise your hands, but how many of us have two left feet spiritually when we try to do everything right and we still fall on our face?
He's preparing us.
Yeah.
He's taking us out of our
Yeah.
normal life, daily life,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
and prepared us for something that's going to come.
Yeah. Yes, sir.
How many times did the man after God's own heart get it wrong?
Yeah. Yeah. David was a man after God's own heart, and he kept messing up. But his heart was right the whole time. So we read here that God will be king over all the earth. Now, verse 16. And it shall come to pass. This is after Jesus. Now, Jesus is not king over the earth today. Paul said Satan is the god of this world, this age. But in that day and time, Satan will be bound, and Jesus will be the God of the millennial age, the 1,000 years. It shall come to pass, verse 16, that everyone that is left of all the nations who came against Jerusalem, that's going to be a major battle. You ever heard of Armageddon? Shall even go up from year to worship the king. Now stop right there. This is not a human king. Jesus said, you shall worship the Lord your God and him only. This king is God. Notice, you shall worship the king, capital K, the Lord of hosts. And to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now don't say, well, you're contradicting what my denomination teaches. I'm not responsible for what they teach. I'm just telling you what God said. And I'm dumb enough to believe what he said. What about you? Do you believe what God said?
Yeah.
Every one of us will be keeping the Feast of Tabernacles when Jesus comes back. Not when he comes back, maybe, but everybody will be forced to do it. Now let's read on, I'll show you. And it shall come to pass, it shall be that whoso will not come up of all the families of the earth, all the families, all the ethnic groups, all the races. This is not for Jews. This is for all the families of the earth. To worship the King, the Lord of hosts, even upon them shall be no rain. Drought. And if the family of Egypt go not up and come not that have no rain, they still won't come. There shall be the plague. Do you think God means business? Wherewith the Lord will smite the heathen. There are no heathen nations in heaven. Wherewith God will smite the heathen that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, God's not doing that today. You don't have to obey God if you don't want to. You go out and serve the devil if you want to. God will stand by and let you do it. But you can only do that until Jesus comes. And after that, you won't be allowed to do it anymore. You can do anything you want to do until Jesus comes. And there won't be any freedom of religion then. It'll be God's religion. That's what it's going to be. So, in verse 18, if they don't have any rain, there will be the plague, where God will smite the heathen. Now, verse 19, this shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations. Africa, Europe, Asia, the United States, Canada, Mexico, all of South America. This shall be the punishment of Egypt and the punishment of all nations that come not up to keep the Feast of Tabernacles. Now, there will be billions of people left after the tribulation period and the day of the Lord. All of those billions can't come to Jerusalem, but they can send delegates, because that will be the capital of the world. Just like we send delegates to Washington, D.C., 535 congressmen. Now, what's it going to be like in that beautiful world? Isaiah 2. You may want to turn there with me. What will it be like when there is no devil running loose? What will it be like in the millennium? Well, first of all, I've got some newspapers here, and I didn't go through a bunch of them. I just picked up what was on top. And then I got one from Billy this morning. I just picked this up. It was on top of the newspapers I had. The Charlotte Observer. 12 months, 1,200 deaths. How many people had died in just 1 year from gun violence? Kids died in accidents and murder, suicides. On the front page of the Charlotte Observer. These headlines won't be around when Jesus returns to this earth. And the sad thing is, inside of this paper here, that's not it. Let's see, it must be right here. You have look at all these names. Nearly 1,200 kids killed by guns in 12 months. Violence. Look at all these names. These are the kids that died. Here's one that's 14, 16, 18, 15. These are all teenagers. Here's one that says 0. This must have been a baby that died from gun violence. 1, 3 months. Tariq Morris, 3 months. 13, 15. Here's a 4-year-old kid killed of gun violence. This won't be going on after Christ returns. No more of this. No more at all. Here's another one I just picked up in some newspapers I have. Protesters gather after police shoot and kill man. No more headlines like that anymore. And like I said, I didn't go through these papers to pick out just the bad ones. I just grabbed whatever I had. You can do the same thing. You can just pick up a newspaper at any time, and you'll see those kind of headlines. This is today's paper, October the 14th. Billy loaned me this one. Family seeks answers after police kill Texas woman in her home. No more headlines like that anymore. No. Serial rapist arrested after police matched DNA in Charlotte cold cases. Serial rapist. Dear me. No more headlines like this. When you look at our headlines today, it's all bad news. Now listen to Isaiah 2. when Jesus returns. Verse 2, it shall come to pass in the last days, the mountain of the Lord's house will be established in the top of the mountains. Verse 3, many people shall go and say, let's go to the house of the Lord. That's the temple in the millennium. To the house of the God of Jacob. He will teach us his ways. They're going to learn about God's holy days, for example. And we will walk in his paths. For out of Zion shall go forth the law. The law wasn't done away. And the word of the Lord from Jerusalem. Verse 4, he'll judge among the nations and will rebuke many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares. So you'll see tanks that are invented to kill people that will be out plowing fields. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore. Verse 11, the last line, the Lord alone shall be exalted in that day. Again, in that day. Isaiah chapter 11. What will it be like in that day? Can you imagine how beautiful the music will be? None of the junk we hear on the radio today. You know, the devil has corrupted everything. He's corrupted our music, our entertainment. He's corrupted our news. We do have fake news. The devil has corrupted everything he can. And he's corrupted religion. Chapter 11. There shall come, verse 1, a rod out of the stem of Jesse. A rod is rulership. And a branch, see the capital B, refers to Christ, shall grow out of his roots. And the Spirit of the Lord, verse 2, will rest upon him, the Spirit of wisdom and counsel and might, knowledge and fear of the Lord. Verse 4, with righteousness he'll judge the poor. He'll smite the earth with the rod of his mouth, and with the breath of his lips shall he slay the wicked. In that day the slain of the Lord shall be many. Verse 6, God will change the nature of animals. You read in the newspaper about some dog. I just saw it on television here a few days ago. Some dog killed a little kid, a baby. I think it was a pit bull had gotten hold of the baby. And don't ever leave, even though you have a very kind and sweet dog, don't ever leave them with a child because they don't understand. They see that little baby about this big and they think a rabbit, a squirrel. No matter how gentle your dog is, never leave, they're still animals, never leave them with a baby.
Or cats either.
Yeah, or cats. I don't know much about cats, but yeah, don't leave them with an animal like that because they don't understand. Verse 6, but in that day the wolf shall dwell with the lamb and won't eat it. The leopard will lie down with the kid, the goat, and the calf and the young lion and the fatling together, and a little child shall lead them. In the millennium, you'll see this little kid about 3 years old with the mane of a lion walking by like this, carrying the mane. Look here, Mommy, I found him out in the woods. That's a big lion. Imagine that. And if your little girl goes out in the woods and maybe she doesn't come home and it's after dark, you don't have to worry about her. She'll find a great big old bear to lay down with, and that'll keep her warm all night. They won't hurt. God's going to change the nature of animals. Let's hope he gets rid of mosquitoes. But especially the mosquitoes. Verse 7, the cow and the bear shall feed. Their young ones will lie down together. The lion will eat straw like the ox. Rather than the lion killing zebras to eat and other animals or killing people, they'll eat straw. And the sucking child shall play on the hole of the asp, that's a venomous serpent, and the winged child shall put his hand on the cockatrice's den. That's also some type of a venomous serpent. They shall not hurt nor destroy in all my holy mountain, which your commentaries tell you means a kingdom. For the earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord. Not heaven. The earth will be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. And there's a lot more. Verse 12, it talks about the regathering of Israel that will occur at that time. Chapter 35. I could go on and on. Let me just give you one more chapter here in Isaiah. Chapter 35. And really we need to read the whole chapter. Verse 1, the deserts will rejoice and blossom as the rose. Sahara Desert's going to come back to life again. You'll blossom abundantly. Verse 4, say to them that are fearful heart, be strong, fear not. Behold, your God will come. That's Jesus. Even God with a recompense, he will come and save you. And when he comes back, he's the same today as he was in the New Testament. The eyes of the blind will be opened. The ears of the deaf shall be unstopped. Then shall the lame man leap as a hart, and the tongue of the dumb shall sing. And maybe some of those of you who are tone deaf and can't carry a note will be able to sing too in that day. You never know. It's possible. No lion or ravenous beast will be there. Verse 10, the ransomed of the Lord shall return and come to Zion with songs and everlasting joy upon their heads. That's how it's going to be at that time. Now, When? When is this going to occur? Alfred Edersheim, the famous Jew who became a Christian many years ago, who wrote several great big books. He wrote one on the temple and its rituals, and he talked about how that there is a theory that Jesus came in a Jubilee year, or at the time of the Jubilee. And there's reasons for believing that. In fact, one of the things he gives here is Luke chapter 4. And by the way, the Jews, the Orthodox Jews, have a legend that when the Messiah comes, he will come in a Jubilee year. Well, he's already come, and apparently he did come in a Jubilee year. But is he going to return in a Jubilee year? Is there a question there?
Well, this person quoted some verses from Leviticus 23 that you went over a few minutes ago.
Yep.
And then they said, my point is, you have no excuse. We ordered our lulav, esrog, willow, and myrtle branches from Israel. You only believe half of the truth, and I want to know why.
Because we ain't got those things here, and I've never heard of anybody ordering them.
She's saying we don't have an excuse because she ordered hers from Israel.
I didn't know you could. I've never heard of such a thing. But you'd have to order an awful lot of branches to make you a cabin out of those things. We're not just talking about a branch you put on your door. We're talking about making a booth to live in. I don't think they're going to do that. But anyway, let's go on. In Luke chapter 4, and verses 1 through 13 talk about Jesus being tempted in the wilderness. So this is at the beginning of his ministry, which was in 27 AD. And then he came to Nazareth. He was, baptized. Then he went out and was in fasting. And then he came home. And as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day and he stood up to read. Now, verse 18, they gave him the book of Isaiah. Here's what he read. The Spirit of the Lord is upon me, because he's anointed me to preach the gospel to the poor. He sent me to heal the brokenhearted, to preach deliverance to the captives, and recovering of sight to the blind, to set at liberty them that are bruised, to preach the acceptable year of the Lord. What is that year? It's referred to in Ezekiel 46, verse 17, as the year of liberty. The year of liberty. Alfred Edersheim said that's the Jubilee. Now, Jesus started his ministry in 27, but he didn't really liberate anybody in 27. His ministry went for 3.5 years. When did he liberate mankind from their sins? When he died in 31. Now, I don't know. Maybe the year of liberty was when he started his ministry. On the other hand, he didn't come just to be there for that first year. He came there to be 3.5 years, and he couldn't leave until the last year, and very likely that's when the Jubilee is. But I don't know. Let's take a look at it. What I want to point out is this. If there was, as scholars believe, a Jubilee year somewhere between 27 and 31, if there was, and if the Jews could be right, we're speculating, but let's look at it. What if the Messiah comes and sets up his kingdom in a Jubilee? The next Jubilee would be there. Now, if you take your calculator and you start adding, a Jubilee is every 50 years, not every 49, as modern day Jews say, but I won't take time to read it, but Leviticus 25 says it's every 50 years. So if you take 27 and you add 50, you come out with a year 77. So 77 to 81, that would be the next Jubilee after the time of Christ. Your next Jubilee after that would be, 127 to 131. That'd be your second Jubilee. Well, you keep counting. The last Jubilee, therefore, would have been somewhere between 1977 to 1981. And that would be the 39th Jubilee. And Jesus did not come back in the 39th Jubilee. Now, if Jesus returns in our lifetime, the most likely time would not be the 38th or the 39th or the 41st or 42nd. In all likelihood, it would be the 40th. And you know what this is? This is to be the 40th. Why do I say that? Well, in the Bible, 7 is a very special number, 12 is a special number, and 40 is also a special number. It's a very special number. Remember, the flood occurred after 40 days of rain. There were 40 days that the spies searched out the land. There were 40 years in the wilderness. Moses fasted for 40 days on 2 occasions. God said you can whip somebody up to 40 stripes, but no more. Moses was 40 years old when he went into the wilderness the first time. 40 years later, God called him at the age of 80, and he lived another 40 years and died at 120, 3 times 40. Joshua was 40 years old when he was sent out to spy the land. And then he was 80 when they got into the land. Goliath tested Israel for 40 days. Saul reigned for 40 years. In fact, Eli, the last priest before Samuel, he ruled Israel as a judge for 40 years. Then Saul ruled for 40 years. He died. David ruled for 40 years. He died. Solomon reigned for 40 years. The top 3 kings. Now the next Jubilee, now I don't know when the Jubilee is, but if it is around the time when Jesus was here, we have had 39 Jubilees. Even though we don't know the exact year, we have had 39 Jubilees. The next one will be the 40th. Now 40, if you don't know this, 40 is the number in the Bible, according to scholars, and I agree with them, that signifies the completion of trial and testing. 40 means you've completed it. Jubilee is the year of liberty. Wouldn't it be interesting if God chose the 40th Jubilee to come back? Well, maybe he'll choose the 50th. That's 500 years from now. I don't believe that's the case. The Jews are now ready, and I think they're going to be marching around the Temple Mount today in Israel with not 1 but 2 cornerstones to be laid at the Temple Mount. They're getting ready, folks. Yes, sir.
They're finding a whole bunch of mysterious things over in Jerusalem, too.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's all coming together.
Escalators, uncovering earth mounds and stuff that's got a whole bunch of forgotten cities and all kind of stuff over there.
Oh, yeah, they're finding stuff. It's amazing what they're finding in Israel now. As big as this board is, it's never big enough. Okay. The first Adam was created around 4,000 around BC. Jesus came around 2,000 years ago. And that adds up to 6,000 years. The early church, now I don't have the time today to even begin to tell you where to go, but some of the early sub-apostolic fathers talked about how they believed that, now this was the very early church, they believed that God had given a 7,000-year plan for mankind. So the first 6,000 years, Adam, all the way down to the time the second Adam comes, during that 6,000 years, it's like the first 6 days of the week, work, do all your work. But the 7th day pictures the 7th millennium. 7 millennia. We are now at the end of the 6,000 years. If God's law does go back all the way back to the Garden of Eden, from the first Adam unto the second Adam was 80 Jubilees. From the time of Christ until where we are now at the end of the 6,000 years, there are 40 more Jubilees, and that comes to 120 Jubilee periods. You can take your calculator, take 50, divide it into 6,000, and you'll come out to 120. 120. I did a sermon on this some years ago, and I don't have time today to read it to you, but over and over and over and over, you see in the Old Testament, 120, 120, 120. Remember, God told Noah, the world is bad, but I'll give him 120 more years. That's it. And it's all over. 120 is also a time of completion. The trial and testing that the world was going through, God said they only get 120 more years. How many disciples started the church on the day of Pentecost? You tell me. 120 people were there. So that's a very special number. Why? I don't know, but it's a special number. We're coming up not only on the 40th Jubilee from the time that Christ started his ministry, we are coming up on the 120th Jubilee from the time of the first Adam. When will that be? Somewhere right there. If it's that year. Now, right now, as you mentioned, they are planning to build the temple. I want to show you something here. Do a little bit more math here. I want to show you something.
So if you take 3.5
Exactly.
from
Exactly. 3.5 years, plus probably 1 year for the day of the Lord. The Bible indicates that. If 2027 is the 40th Jubilee, what year is this? We're at the end of 2019. We're almost into 2020 now. So we've got between 7 and 8 years, because if they build the temple, and they're talking about, look, today, they're planning to make a march around the Temple Mount with 2 cornerstones to build the temple. That means that either, probably next year, if this is the Jubilee, and if Jesus should come back at that time, we're looking at them building the temple anytime. Yes, sir.
Well, they say they found another site besides the one that they're marching around today that might be where the temple was.
Well, they're surely going to know for positive. God's going to reveal it to them.
For sure, that's where
Yeah.
the original temple was.
Yeah, there are some archaeological questions about it, but I believe in the last days knowledge will be increased, and I believe they're going to know exactly real
See,
soon.
that's the reason why they're uncovering all these other places.
Yeah. Is there a question on there?
Well, it says, Keith, you must share this with us at least for an hour and some. Maybe they are planning to build for the Jubilee.
I don't know. I personally believe that if there was a Jubilee during that time, it's probably the year 31 instead of 27. If my math is right, we've got about 11 more years. Is that right? Did I do that right? Yeah. Now this year's almost over. But that means you got to subtract 7 years. What's that, 4? So the next 4 years they may have the temple built. And people are living like there's just, like time's just going to go on as always. Peter said, they're going to say in the last days, where's the promise of his coming? For since the days of the fathers, nothing has changed. Well, maybe it won't happen in our lifetime. Maybe it's going to be another 200 years. But let me ask you this. Why did God allow the Jews to come back in the middle 20th century? There must have been a reason. After almost 2,000 years, God finally allowed them to come back. Why? To get things ready for the second coming of Jesus. If it's another 200 more years, folks, that doesn't make sense. It's taken them from 1948 until just like the last 2 or 3 years to get everything ready. When I started this college, they were still nowhere near ready. And in 2004, they finally set up the first Sanhedrin since in the days when the temple stood. And by January of 2005, they had it ready and operating. And then they got the vestments and everything else for the priest. They are now ready. Yes, sir.
Well, the Bible says they be doing just like in the day of Noah, running to and fro and marrying and giving in marriage.
Yeah, the world doesn't understand how close we may be.
And everything else.
Yeah, that's what they're doing right now, they got all this controversy about who's supposed to get married and who ain't, so,
Oh, the main thing, and I've been saying this for years, is keep your eyes on Jerusalem, because when they start building the temple, we're on the countdown.
They can check the Temple Mount Faithful online.
Yeah, I can do that.
So,
You have 7 years. The first half, they're offering up sacrifices. And then you have the last 3.5, which is the Great Tribulation. And then after that, you have the Day of the Lord, which goes maybe a year. So we're looking at a very short period of time. We should actually subtract maybe 8 years from that. And we're actually looking at maybe 3 more years. And that's assuming that the Jubilee is in 31 and Christ returns. Now, I'm speculating. Maybe he won't. But do you want to take that chance? How many churches are learning this? How many will hear about it? How many heard about it yesterday? Yes?
From where did you start learning all these things?
Where?
The Jubilee, about all the...
I've known about it for a long time.
Where did you learn about it?
I have been in churches where it was brought out, but there's very few churches that bring that out. And then Alfred Edersheim is one of the primary people, and then there's others too, but I can't remember all where I've heard that. But I do know that the Jews have this legend that the Messiah will come in a Jubilee.
I think there's actually a book written by someone all about the Jubilee year. I don't know who wrote it, but...
You don't have a copy of it, do you?
No, I
I'd
don't
like
know
to see
who
it.
wrote it, but I feel like I've heard of it. A book
Yeah.
just about, the Jubilee year.
Yeah,
explaining it.
this is not something that is just I mean, it is more well known than you might realize. There's a lot of people.
I've heard it before.
Yeah. So the question is, well, will Jesus actually return in a Jubilee? Did he die for our sins in a Jubilee year? He may have. And 31 was the year they started the church. God sent the Holy Spirit. So it's very likely we've got just 2,000 years, which is another interesting thing. In the year 2031, it'll be exactly 2,000 years. Yeah, did you have a quick question?
Well, most of this stuff is explained in Daniel, in the book of Daniel anyway.
Daniel 9. Who else had a question? Yes, sir.
And so the other question is, are we gonna be faithful?
Are we going to be Philadelphians? Because
Yes.
if we've only got 3 more years or even less,
That's up to the individual.
that's up to you personally.
Well, the Bible says that we'll know the time. We may not know the day or the hour, but we'll know the time.
Yeah, there are 2 things. Jesus said to the world, he'll come as a thief in the night. They're not going to be ready. To a lot of our graduates, it may come as a thief in the night. They're not going to be ready. But then 1 Thessalonians 5 says, but that day shall not overtake you as a thief in the night. 1 Thessalonians 5. It won't overtake you. That's assuming that you're staying alert. Watch and pray always. But now, remember in Revelation 3 to the Sardis church, he said, if you don't repent, I will come on you as a thief in the night. So we can keep our eyes on Jerusalem. Now remember in Luke 21, I gotta let you go, I'm holding over time here. But in Luke 21, Jesus said, watch and pray, but he also said, when you see these things begin to come to pass,
That's right.
begin to come to pass, lift up your eyes, your redemption draws near. How close are we? Could I be wrong? Yeah, I could be wrong. Maybe it's another 200 years, but do you really think so? Listen, with the atomic bomb, how could the world even survive another 100? Yeah.
What did he say to the church, the Laodicea?
He said, I'm going to spew the Laodiceans out of my mouth. So if we're lukewarm, we're not really obeying God. He's just going to say, no. Only the Philadelphians, out of all those 7 churches, only the Philadelphians are promised protection when all this whole thing happens. The Great Tribulation, also the day of the Lord, which is the time of God's wrath. That's Satan's wrath. This is God's wrath. He said you can escape it all if you're watching and praying, but you want to make sure you're a Philadelphian.
Well,
Yeah, go
you
ahead.
know, when they start building that temple, you're going to know that your redemption is nigh.
Yeah. And there, you may want to check well, I'll tell you what. I'll check my email when I go home today. And this coming Sabbath, I'll let y'all know. For those of you who are in class on Thursday night, I'll let you know what I found out. Yes?
Jesus says we can read the seasons to be alert.
Yeah. We're to keep our eyes open. So, what's the Feast of Tabernacles about? It's about the 1,000-year millennial reign. I didn't read that to you. I meant to. Revelation 20, chapter 19, starting at verse 11. When the king returns on a white horse, it says he's coming back as King of Kings and Lord of Lords. Verses 1 through 3 of chapter 20. He's going to put the devil away. And then beginning in verse 4, it says we're going to reign with him 1,000 years.
So that's what I was gonna ask you, is there gonna be any work during that 1,000 years?
Sure. Work, building, creating, building cities, rebuilding the world. After World War III, there's a lot of work that's going to be done. We just won't be working on God's Sabbaths weekly and annual. We won't be doing that. But yeah, there's going to be a lot of work being done, a lot of
It's gonna be
construction.
desolate.
Yeah, the world's going to be one. It's like Europe after World War II was so desolate, especially Germany. People said it'd take half a century to build that thing. It'd be impossible to rebuild it. It looked like. But the Germans got in there, rolled up their sleeves, and went to work. And within 25 years, they were rebuilding Germany. They were having it rebuilt. So there's going to be a lot of work. But you and I don't have to, we're not going to be human. If you're serving Christ, you're going to have a glorified body. And you're going to be ruling. You're not going to be ruling me or him or her. You're going to be ruling over the human beings who don't have their glorified body. And all the people who are born during the millennium, who are born human, you're going to be ruling over them. And what are you going to rule? How are you going to rule? You're going to be teaching them God's word. Remember, we just read that scripture, the word of the Lord shall go forth from Jerusalem. Where will you be? With Christ. Where will he be? Jerusalem. And you're going to be with him. And you're going to be teaching people the word of the Lord. That's why you got to learn it now. Because you're not going to be able to teach what you haven't learned. Yes, ma'am.
I'm just wondering, since all of this is what God has ordained is going to happen, the destruction, desolation, people that are praying for peace and praying that this stuff stop, are they in the wrong or?
No, the Bible does say pray for the peace of Jerusalem. And that answer will come after Christ returns. Right now, there's not going to be any peace over there. We know that. It's good to pray for our country, pray for our leaders. Paul tells us, pray for those in authority. That doesn't mean, though, this is still not going to happen.
Well, don't the Bible say they'll be running around hollering about peace, peace, and there is no peace?
Yeah, that's in the Bible too.
So, you know, peace is gonna come and
Yeah.
deceive them
Mhm.
for a while.
Yeah.
But just like
Well-
I was getting ready to say, you know,
This will probably be a time of
Yeah.
peace.
Yeah.
but just like I was getting ready to say, 2 days ago, they cut the lights out in California.
Yeah.
And cause they was afraid the windstorm's gonna blow down all the electric lines and start a fire.
Yeah.
Well, the fire started anyway. They got 8,000 acres out there burning up
Yeah.
right now.
And Christ can put a stop to that when he returns. If that's still going on. And it might be. Things like that will still be going on.
Just look at the building in Louisiana they just built. They ain't even finished it and it fell down.
Yeah, I saw that on the news too. Any other questions?
11-story building fell down.
All this stuff we read in our newspapers, all these people getting shot, getting raped, and all this stuff, this will be old news one day. And you'll hear about it on documentaries, on television, if they even have television there. The first few years will probably won't. But you'll hear about how the world used to be. And those of you who watch your children and grandchildren, great-grandchildren, and great-great-grandchildren grow up in the millennium, you'll be able to tell them what it was like because you lived during this very exciting time. This is a very exciting time to live.
Yeah, it is.
Well, how many Ukrainians do you think they killing over there in Ukraine?
Now, we got all kinds of problems in the world. But after all this is over, it's going to be a world of peace for 1,000 years. Peace.
I think the beginning of sorrows has already started.
Yeah. But I'm talking about the good stuff now. Peace for
I know what
1,000
you're
years.
talking about, but
And love between all peoples, all nations. You see? All nations. Any questions? Any final questions?
Give us about 10 seconds. There's
All
a
right,
delay
I'll give you
on
10
mine.
seconds. Now, next Monday will be the last great day because now, see, Trump's pictures his second coming. Day of Atonement, he immediately, what he does when he comes back, he's going to reconcile the world. Tabernacles, 1,000 years. What is the 8th day? That pictures what happens after the millennium. Be here next Monday because it tells you something. It's a day of rejoicing. It's a day of happiness. What happens after the millennium? We're going to find out next Monday. All right, any questions there? No? All right, well, thank you all for coming out. Thank all of you watching over the internet. We're dismissed. We'll see you all this coming Sabbath and then next Monday. God bless. You got a question?